The circle formed the way bad things always do, slowly, then all at once. Sergeant Elias Vorn stood at the center of the throne room of the Vreth Ascendancy's Third Moon Palace, and he was aware, with the calm precision of a man who has made his peace with dying before, that every weapon in the chamber was pointed at him. The 6 commanders of the Royal Guard stood at equidistant points around him, hands resting on the hilts of their resonance blades. The court officials had retreated to the walls. The light through the crystalline ceiling fell in bars of violet and gold, cutting across the polished obsidian floor, and Elias thought, in a detached and quiet corner of his mind, that the room was genuinely beautiful. He was wearing standard human field fatigues, faded gray, no rank patch. The shoulder where his sergeant's chevrons had once been was smooth fabric. He'd removed them himself 3 weeks ago when the assignment began. No rank insignia, no diplomatic credentials, no weapons, just the fatigues, worn boots, and a thermos of coffee gone cold on his belt because nobody had told him to leave it behind and he'd forgotten to ask. The commander directly in front of him, tall, carapaced with the amber optical clusters of a Vreth in his prime, spoke in the layered harmonic that passed for formal address in their language. The translation chip behind Elias' left ear rendered it as, "You are standing in the seat of sovereignty. You have no right to be here. You have no rank. You have no sponsor. You carry no weapons that we can detect." And yet a pause, long and strange like a held breath, the guard opened for you. Explain this. Elias looked at him for a moment. He scratched the back of his neck. He said, "I honestly don't know how to explain it in a way that's going to satisfy you." The second commander, shorter, older, her carapace worn pale at the edges, made a sound that the translator rendered as a legal citation, the Vreth equivalent of invoking rights of summary execution. The third commander, who Elias had started privately thinking of as the young one because of how he gripped his blade like he was still practicing the motion, took a step forward. The door behind the dais, the inner door, the one that led to the private chambers of the Ascendant Throne, opened. 12 royal guards stepped through it in double formation, and they moved with the particular kind of crisp unity that takes decades to build. At their head was Commander Arith Voss, captain of the Royal Guard, a Vreth so old his carapace had gone to matte black, who wore more campaign citations on his thorax plate than most officers accumulated in 3 lifetimes. He looked at the 6 commanders. He looked at Elias. He said, in the common trade tongue, "This human is under my protection. The next commander who raises a blade will answer to the throne." The silence in the room had texture to it. You could have walked across it. The first commander said, very carefully, "On what authority?" And Commander Arith Voss reached into the sealed pocket of his duty plate and removed a folded document, pressed it flat against his palm. Old paper, actual paper, rare on any Vreth world, covered in a script that every soul in the room recognized as the private hand of the late Ascendant. 6 reasons, said Arith Voss, written 6 months before the Ascendant's death. I was instructed to produce them when required. He looked at Elias. Elias sipped from his thermos. The coffee was terrible. He didn't show it on his face. He had known, in a theoretical way, that something like this might happen. He had not known what it would feel like to stand inside it. He was discovering that it felt a great deal like the Badlands Crossing, back on Turrith Station, like thirst, and wait, and the certain knowledge that the water was farther than it looked, but that sitting down was not an option. He'd cross it. He always did. That was the thing about humans that the galaxy kept miscalculating. The first reason was not written in the document. It existed only in Arith Voss's memory, in the form of a night 8 months ago when he had been summoned alone to the Ascendant's private chamber, and found the most powerful being in 40 light-years of settled space, sitting with his primary limbs wrapped around his own secondary torso, in the posture Elias would later come to recognize as Vreth, for I am trying very hard not to panic. The crisis was the Harith Compact, a rival faction, not at war with the Ascendancy but maneuvering toward it, had been running intelligence insertions into the palace's administrative core for 6 years. They had cultivated 3 of the Ascendant's own advisors. They were 6 weeks from having enough leverage to destabilize the succession. The Ascendant's own intelligence service had told him this, and then his own intelligence service had told him something else, that they could not identify the insertions, because whoever had trained the Harith assets had trained them using a methodology that Vreth counterintelligence was not equipped to recognize. The methodology was human. The Ascendant had looked at Commander Arith Voss and said, "We need a human." Arith Voss had said, with the careful precision of a soldier who has survived 40 years of court politics, "The Ascendancy does not currently maintain relations with the human collective that would allow for a formal request." "I know. Any informal contact would require an intermediary who was not documented in any official record." "I know. The human would need to operate without credentials, without diplomatic protection, without any official acknowledgement of their presence." "Yes." A pause. "Ascendant," said Arith Voss, "with respect, what human would accept those terms?" The Ascendant had made a sound that translated roughly as "I have no idea, find one," and had dismissed him. It had taken Arith Voss 2 months, and a chain of contacts that he was profoundly relieved no one had ever asked him to document. And at the end of it, in a shipping depot on the neutral station of Turith 4, he had met Sergeant Elias Vorn. Elias had been eating, of all things, from a food container that contained something orange and gelatinous that smelled like a chemical accident. He'd offered Arith Voss some. Arith Voss had declined. Elias had shrugged and kept eating and said, "So what's the job?" Arith Voss had explained it, all of it. The Harith insertions, the compromised advisors, the methodology, the complete absence of official cover or protection. The fact that if anything went wrong, the Ascendancy would have no knowledge of him. Elias had finished his food. He had set the container down. He had looked at Arith Voss with pale human eyes that were, the commander noted, entirely calm, not brave calm, not pretending to be calm, but actually calm, the way a man is calm about things he has already decided, and said, "Okay. When do we start?" Arith Voss, who had prepared several arguments, had said, "You're not going to ask about payment, about extraction protocols, about what happens if the mission fails." "Sure," said Elias, "but you were going to get to those, right?" "Yes." "Then let's get to them. I'm not going to change my answer, I just want to know the specifics." Arith Voss had filed that moment in his memory under humans. He had added to that file many times since. The first reason the Royal Guard obeyed him was, the Ascendant had asked them to trust the human who agreed to do the impossible thing without demanding proof it was possible first. The second reason lived in a maintenance corridor on sublevel 14 of the palace complex, and it belonged to a guard lieutenant named Tessivar, who had come around a corner 3 weeks into Elias' operation, and found him sitting cross-legged on the floor with a data pad balanced on his knee and 3 opened wall panels surrounding him like a mechanical flower. "What," said Tessivar, reaching for her blade, "are you doing?" "Finding your third advisor," said Elias without looking up. "Sit down, this is going to take a minute." Tessivar did not sit down. She said, "I will take you to detention and let command sort this out." "In about 40 seconds, Elias said. "The Harith asset in your communications relay is going to transmit a package to an external node. If I can interrupt the handshake at this junction." He reached into the open panel and made a very small adjustment. "Then yes, you can take me to detention afterward, and command can sort it out with whatever evidence I've just captured. Or you can draw your blade and I lose the window and you don't find your advisor and the compact finishes the job. Up to you." 40 seconds passed. A soft chime came from the data pad. Elias looked at it. He said quietly, "There you are." He looked up at Tessivar. He said, "Third advisor's name is Orathvel. He's been with the palace for 11 years. He's not ideologically compromised. They have his clutch sister in a containment facility on Harith Prime. He doesn't want to do it. That doesn't make him less dangerous, but it's worth knowing before you interrogate him." Tessavar looked at him for a very long time. She said, "You knew I was going to come around this corner." "I knew someone was. The patrol rotation has a 6-minute gap on this sublevel between the second and third watch. I've been using it. Figured eventually someone would close the gap. And you sat here anyway." The job needed doing. She did not put him in detention. She stood in the corridor and watched the door while he finished, and when he was done she walked him to the nearest lift and said nothing, but pressed her fist briefly against her thorax plate, the Vreth gesture. He had learned, for something that doesn't have a clean translation but lands somewhere between "I see you" and "you are real." The second reason was, he'd done the work even knowing he was going to get caught doing it. The third reason was older, and it belonged to Arithvas alone, learned not from watching Elias but from what Elias had said in the crossing of what the humans called the burn. The 3-day transit through the quarantine zone that separated Turith Station from Vreth space, in a ship with failing environmental systems and rations for 2.5 days. On the second day, when they were certain the recyclers were not going to recover, Arithvas had found Elias in the cargo bay. He was not panicking. He was not rationing his water with the careful calculation that Arithvas himself was running in the back of his mind. He was doing something that Arithvas could only describe as making the best of it. He had found a leaking coolant line and was using it to keep his food stores cold, and he had cannibalized a non-essential monitoring unit to boost signal on the long-range communicator, not because he thought it would work, but because it was something to try. Arithvas had said, "Are you not afraid?" Elias had thought about this with what appeared to be genuine consideration. He said, "I mean, yeah. But fear doesn't fix the recycler. You might die here." "Might haven't yet." He handed Arithvas a strip of something preserved and edible. "Eat this. You're starting to move like you're rationing and we need you sharp." Arithvas ate it. It tasted like a bad decision made by someone who did not understand salt, but it was food. He said, "How do you do this? Live with that awareness and not," he searched for the trade tongue word, "contract" around it. Elias was quiet for a moment. He said, "When I was maybe 16, my dad took me and my brother into the backcountry. We got 3 days out and a flash flood cut us off from the trail back. We had food for maybe a day. He sat us down and he said, 'We're going to solve this one thing at a time, and we are not going to decide we're dead until we're dead.' So we solved the first thing, and then the second thing, and eventually we solved all the things and we walked out." He shrugged. "I don't know if it's philosophy or just what happens when you're raised somewhere that tries to kill you pretty often." Arithvas said, "And if you run out of things to solve?" Elias looked at him. He said, "I've never run out." They made it through the burn. The recyclers never recovered, but Elias had thought of 7 other things to try, and the 4th one worked well enough. The third reason was, humans had apparently decided, at some point in their evolutionary history, that dying was not an acceptable response to a problem. The 4th reason was not gentle. It had to do with the Harith assassination team that had come for the Ascendant 14 weeks into the operation, on a night when every sightline in the palace had been compromised by the kind of professional precision that came from years of planning. Elias had not been supposed to be in the inner corridor. He had been running a separate thread, a financial trace on the third advisor's communication costs, and he had turned a corner and walked directly into 2 Harith operatives moving fast and quiet toward the Ascendant's chambers. There had been no time to call for help. There had been no time for anything except the fact of the situation. Afterward, the court physicians who examined him said that a human should not have been able to do what he did with what he had, which was a data pad, a length of conduit he'd been carrying for reasons that had made sense at the time, and the specific advantage of not being built anything like the people he was fighting. Vreth musculature is dense and powerful in the primary limbs. Human musculature is distributed differently, more flexible, more capable of sustained exertion, adaptive in ways that Vreth biology does not expect and therefore does not guard against. He had not won cleanly. There was a slash across his left side that the physicians would later tell him had been 2 centimeters from ending the conversation permanently. He had sat on the floor of the corridor for 3 minutes, breathing through the pain, running the calculation of whether he could walk, deciding he could, and then walking to the Ascendant's chamber door and knocking. The door had opened. The Ascendant had looked at him, at the corridor behind him, at him again. Elias had said, "There's a problem in the East Corridor. I've addressed it. You should probably know that your security perimeter has a gap on sublevel 2. I'll write it up." He had paused. "I might need to sit down for a minute." The Ascendant had said nothing for a very long time. Then he had made a sound that translated as something close to the human concept of awe, but older and more complicated, with layers of duty and weight, and the specific feeling of a being who has just understood something about the universe that he had not known 5 minutes ago. He had let Elias in. He had called the court physicians. He had sat beside the human while they worked, not because protocol required it, but because he had found himself unable to simply return to his quarters and pretend that nothing had just rearranged itself in his understanding of the word impossible. The 4th reason was written in the document, in the Ascendant's own hand, as a single line. He bled for my life before I ever asked him to. The 5th reason was the one that the 6 commanders in the throne room did not know about, and would not have believed, and this is what it was. 3 days before the Ascendant's death, before any of them had known he was dying, because he had not told them, he had called Elias to his private study. Not through official channels. A message through HFY, informal, the kind of summons that had started to become its own language between them over the months. "I would like to speak with the human, please." Elias had come. He had sat without ceremony in the chair across from the Ascendant's desk and said, "You look like you have bad news." The Ascendant had said, "I am dying." Elias had been quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry." Not "I'm sorry for the implications." Not "I'm sorry for the political situation." Not "I'm sorry this will cause problems." Just, "I'm sorry." Simple and direct and true. The Ascendant said, "I have been managing it for some time. The succession is in place. What I need to discuss with you is what happens after." They had talked for 2 hours. The Ascendant had told him things he had not told his court. Things about the Harith Compact's longer strategy, about vulnerabilities in the succession that went beyond the immediate crisis, about what he was afraid of in the years to come. He had talked to Elias the way Elias later came to understand most beings with enormous power talk when they find someone they trust with none of it, freely. At the end of it, the Ascendant had said, "I want to give you something. You don't have to." "It is not for you," the Ascendant said. "It is for my guard. They will need to trust someone after I am gone, and I will not be here to ask it of them. I would like to ask it now and have it ready." He had pressed his primary hands flat on the desk. "6 reasons. Will you permit me to give them 6 reasons?" Elias had said, "You should know I'm probably going to leave when the job is done." "I know. I'm not looking to be a permanent fixture in anyone's court." "I know that too." Elias had been quiet for a moment. He said, "Then yeah, 6 reasons sounds about right." The 5th reason was never written down. It was only in the memory of 2 people, one of whom was dead. The Ascendant had said, "Because he did not want the power I was offering him and gave it back, and that is the only kind of person I would ever give it to." And the 6th reason was the one that Arithvas read aloud in the throne room, in front of the 6 commanders and the retreated court officials, and the 24 royal guard at attention, with the paper held flat in his palm and the violet and gold light falling across all of them. It was short. It said, "Because in 30 years of rule I met exactly one being, of any species, who walked into the center of impossible things without a plan to profit from them. The guard will obey him because I could not train a guard that good, because what he is cannot be trained. Because if you are reading this, it means something has gone wrong, and if something has gone wrong, you need the human more than you need the protocol that tells you he has no standing here. Trust the human. He will not abuse it. He does not know how." Areth Voss folded the paper. He placed it back in his thorax plate. He looked at the 6 commanders. The first commander was very still. The second had lowered her hand from her blade. The third, the young one, was staring at Elias with an expression that the translation chip tried to render as something between challenge and the moment before challenge collapses into respect. It was the young one who spoke first. He said, "6 reasons." "6 reasons," Areth Voss confirmed. The young one looked at Elias. He said in careful, formal trade tongue, "The first 4 are documented. The 5th is a pause understood to be private. What is the 6th?" Elias looked at Areth Voss. Areth Voss said, "It is in the letter." "I know what the letter says. I am asking the human." A silence. Elias thought about it. He set his thermos back on his belt. He said, "He told me the 6th reason was because I didn't want anything he had. I'm not sure that's a qualification, but it was his to decide." The young one looked at him for a long time. His grip on his blade had loosened, not completely, but enough. He said, "What do you want then? If you are here without rank, without credentials, without weapons, what is it that you came here to do?" Elias looked around the throne room, the 6 commanders, the retreated officials, the perfect formation of the royal guard behind Areth Voss, the beauty of the room with its terrible weight of everything it meant. He said, "Finish the job." "The Harith Compact. Areth Voss tells me there are still 3 secondary nodes in the palace network that haven't been cleaned out, and there's a financial conduit through your merchant licensing board that I haven't had time to trace yet. And whoever trained the Harith assets knows their insertions got burned, which means they'll adapt the methodology, which means someone needs to understand what the adaptation looks like before it shows up somewhere else." He paused. "So yeah, finish the job. That's what I came to do." The young one was still watching him. He said very quietly, "And then?" Elias shrugged. It was a deeply human gesture, and in the stillness of the throne room it landed like a stone in still water. "Then I go home, get some sleep, figure out what's next." The young one turned to the first commander. Something passed between them in the harmonic range, too fast and too layered for the translation chip. Then the first commander looked at Areth Voss, then at Elias. He said formally, in the layered register of official recognition, "We acknowledge the Ascendant's instruction." He placed his hand on the hilt of his blade. Areth Voss went rigid. Several members of the royal guard shifted. And the first commander drew his blade, slowly, with ceremony, not toward Elias but downward, and pressed it flat against the floor in the Vreth gesture of recognized standing. One by one, the other 5 commanders did the same. Elias watched them. He did not know all the specifics of the gesture, but he understood what it was. He felt something happen in his chest, the particular feeling of a thing landing that you had not entirely let yourself anticipate until it arrived. He said quietly, "I appreciate that, I really do." Areth Voss appeared at his left shoulder. Very quietly, in a register the commanders wouldn't catch, he said, "Are you all right?" Elias thought about it. He said, "Ask me again when I finish the coffee." "It has been cold for 6 hours." "Yeah," he unclipped the thermos, drank, made a face. "Still, it's coffee." The thing that the galaxy had never fully absorbed about humans, despite evidence, despite documentation, despite the long and repeatedly uncomfortable history of watching the species do things that should not have been survivable, was that they did not separate the small from the large. They carried both at the same time, and they kept going. Elias Vorn spent the next 3 weeks finishing the job. He found the secondary nodes. He traced the financial conduit. It ran through 6 shell accounts, 3 translation agencies, and a Vreth antiquities dealer who turned out to be genuinely innocent and was nearly as relieved about it as Elias was. He spent 4 days in sublevel communication archives reconstructing the methodology adaptation and wrote it up in a 30-page document that he handed to Arith Voss with the note, on the front page in handwriting that would have looked messy to anyone who hadn't spent time deciphering it. This is what they'll try next, and here's how to catch it. The young commander, whose name Elias eventually learned was Sareven, came to find him on the 14th day, in the same sublevel corridor where Tessivar had found him in the beginning. Different wall panel. Same cross-legged posture. Sareven said, "I have a question." Elias said, "I have an answer, possibly, depends on the question." The Ascendant's letter says you do not know how to abuse the trust you are given. Is that true? Or is it a thing he believed that is not accurate? Elias took his hands out of the panel. He thought about this seriously. He said, "I don't know, I've never tried. I know what I'm here to do and I do it, whether that's incapacity or just. What I am, I genuinely couldn't tell you." Sareven was quiet for a moment. He said, "On my homeworld before the Ascendancy unified us, there was a phrase. It translates roughly as, 'The quality of a weapon is proven by what it refuses to cut.'" He paused. "I am trying to determine if you are a weapon." "I'm a sergeant," Elias said, "retired technically." And yet, Elias agreed. He put his hands back in the wall panel. After a moment, Sareven crouched beside him and said, "What do you need me to do?" Elias told him. He listened carefully, and he did it exactly. He had the particular quality that Elias had noticed in the best soldiers he'd worked with, not the loudest or the most decorated, but the ones you'd want in the hole with you when everything went sideways, an ability to set down their own frame of reference and just work the problem. They spent 3 hours in the corridor. At the end of it, they had the last node, clean and documented, and Sareven sat back on his heels and looked at Elias with the amber glow of his optical clusters and said, "You are strange." "Probably," Elias said. "I do not mean it as an insult. I know. I mean that you are not what I expected, from a human, from any of the things I had heard." Elias looked at him. He said, "What did you hear?" "That humans are reckless, aggressive, that they don't think before they move, that they are good in a fight but you cannot trust them with anything that requires patience." "Some of that's true," Elias said, "about some of us, probably true about most species if you pick the right individuals." He paused. "What do you think now?" Sareven considered this with what Elias had come to recognize as the Vreth version of genuine engagement, a slight stillness, a slowing of the ambient harmonic. He said, "I think the Ascendant was correct. I think you are something that cannot be trained. And I think," a pause, "I think I do not understand humans at all, and I am starting to believe that this is because there is genuinely more to understand than I had allocated space for." Elias smiled. It was tired and real and a little crooked. He said, "That's about the nicest thing anyone said to me in 2 years." On the 23rd day, Elias sat with Arith Voss in the captain's private office and handed him the 30-page document and a supplemental 6-page addendum, and a data chip containing everything he'd been unable to fit in the written material. Arith Voss looked at it. He said, "Is this everything?" "Everything I found. I put a flag on page 27. There's one thread I wasn't able to close. The compact had an asset in your supply chain logistics that I couldn't identify by name, only by behavioral signature. I've documented the signature. Your own people should be able to find it now, but it might take some time. How much time? Couple of months, maybe. Whoever trained them was good. He paused. They were trained by a human. Former intelligence went private. Names in the addendum. He's not under any active warrant. The collective doesn't claim jurisdiction over private contractors working alien theater, but you might want to make that an official problem because he'll do this again. Arith Voss absorbed this, he said, and the asset we cannot identify. I'm sorry I couldn't close that one. Do not apologize. This, Arith Voss set the documents down, is more than the Ascendant hoped for when he sent me to find a human. It is more than I expected when I found you specifically. He paused. You are leaving. Tomorrow morning. The supply manifest out of sublevel docking lists me as a technical consultant on an atmospheric calibration contract. Should be clean. And if it is not clean? Elias shrugged. Then I solve that problem when I get to it. Arith Voss made a sound. It was, Elias had come to know, the sound a very old soldier makes when he is trying not to be emotional about something. He said, the new Ascendant has been briefed. She knows what you did here. She will want to formalize your standing in some way, a title, a designation, something that can be put in the records. Tell her I appreciate it, but no. She will insist. Tell her I respectfully insist back. Elias met the old commander's optical clusters. I came here to do a job. I did it. If I take a title, then I'm not a person who did a job anymore. I'm a court asset. And eventually somebody decides what that means and starts putting requirements on it. I don't want that. A pause. I want to go home. Arith Voss was quiet for a long time. Then he said, the letter, you know what it says. You read it to a room full of people. What do you think of it? Elias was quiet. He turned the cold thermos over in his hands. I think he was generous, he said. I think he saw something in me that might be more about how he wanted to see things than about what's actually there. I think he was a very good, whatever the right word is, a very good ruler, a very good being. He paused. I think I'm going to miss him, which is strange because I never let myself think I would. Arith Voss said, he missed you too, before you were gone. He said, a pause, very old, very careful. He said that he had spent 40 years ruling and had never once found someone who came to his court to help him rather than to use him. He said that meeting you had changed something he had stopped expecting to change. Elias didn't say anything. There was a long silence. Then he said quietly, that's a heavy thing to put in a person. Yes, said Arith Voss. He was aware of that. He did it anyway. Because he knew I could carry it. I believe so. Elias sat with it. Outside the narrow window of the captain's office, the moon's surface stretched pale and still in the night cycle's artificial dark, and the stars of the Vreth inner systems were scattered across it like something expensive and careless. He thought about his father in the backcountry, the flash flood, the one thing at a time. He thought about the burn crossing, and the cold corridor, and the slash across his left side that had been 2 centimeters from ending everything, and the moment in the throne room when 6 blades had gone down in a gesture he'd never expected to see pointed at him. He thought about the dead king who had written 6 reasons down on paper, who had known he was dying, and had spent some of that time making sure a human with no rank and no insignia would be able to stand in the center of impossible things and have somewhere to stand. He said he didn't have to do that. Arith Voss said no. He had enough to worry about. Yes. He did it anyway. Yes, said Arith Voss. He was in the end a great deal like you. Elias left on the supply manifest in the early morning before the court woke. He carried the cold thermos and his worn boots and the faded gray fatigues with the smooth shoulder where the chevrons had been. He did not take anything he had not come with. At the sublevel docking bay, Soraven was waiting. He was not in duty formation. He was just standing there, at ease, in the way soldiers stand when they are not on post but cannot quite switch it off. He said, "Safe transit." Elias said, "Take care of the palace." "It is my purpose." "I know, take care of it anyway." He hesitated. Then he extended his right hand. He had explained at some point in the past 3 weeks the human convention around it, the ancient mammalian gesture, the open palm, "No weapon, I see you, you are real." Sauravin looked at it. He placed his primary hand against it, smaller, carapaced, warm in the particular way that Vreth extremities ran warm, and held it for a moment. He said, "When the compact adapts, if we cannot identify it, you have the behavioral signature. You'll find it. And if we don't—" Elias looked at him. He said, "Then I'll know how to reach Arith Vas, and he'll know how to reach me, and we'll figure it out." Sauravin held his hand for a moment longer. Then he released it and stepped back and brought his fist against his thorax plate. Elias nodded. He picked up his transit case. He walked to the ship. At the top of the ramp, he looked back once. The docking bay was clean and quiet in the pre-cycle dim. Sauravin was still standing where he'd left him. Elias raised one hand. Not a salute, just a wave. Simple and true, the way things are when you stop having anything to prove. He went aboard, the ramp sealed, the ship moved. On the manifest, he was listed as a technical consultant. Nothing else. No rank, no credentials. No designation that would mean anything to anyone who hadn't been in the throne room that day, watching 6 blades go down. He found his bunk. He put the thermos in the storage net. He pulled his boots off because they had been on for 27 hours and his feet felt like complaints. He lay back and looked at the featureless ceiling of a supply ship in transit, and he thought about home and what sleep would feel like and what would come next. He did not know what would come next. That was fine, he never had. That had always been fine. He closed his eyes. Outside, the stars of the Vreth inner systems fell away behind the ship, and the dark of the transit lane opened ahead, and somewhere in the palace on the moon they were leaving. An old commander in a private office sat with a folded piece of paper and the weight of 30 years of service and the specific feeling of having witnessed, one more time, the impossible thing that humans kept doing. The thing that had no name in any Vreth language, that translated only sideways and wrong, that came out as something like. They go into the dark without knowing what's in it, and they come back with their hands full. Not always, not every time, but enough. Enough to matter. Enough to change what a being who has ruled for 40 years stops expecting to change. Enough to write down, in a dying hand on actual paper, 6 reasons why the guard should trust him. They had trusted him. He had not let them down. He went asleep. There is a thing that happens to soldiers after long operations in hostile territory. It is not talked about much, because the talking of it requires a kind of precision that most people who haven't done it don't have the vocabulary for, and most people who have done it don't feel like explaining. It is the thing that happens in the space between the last day of the operation and the first day of the rest of your life, in the hours when you are neither one nor the other, when your body has not yet received the message that the weight is gone, when your nervous system is still running threat assessment on every peripheral movement, when you wake up at 0300 with your heart doing math you didn't ask it to do. Elias had done this before. He did it now on the supply ship, alone in a bunk that was not designed for human dimensions, in a transit lane that smelled of recycled oxygen and industrial lubricant. He lay awake in the dark, and he let his body do the accounting. It had been a long operation. Longer than most, stranger than most, in a palace on a moon of a world that had not, 6 months ago, existed on any map he was cleared to look at. He had done the work. He had found what needed finding. He had held the line in a corridor with 2 opponents and no room for anything except being faster and less predictable than they expected, which was the only real advantage he had ever been able to count on. He thought about the Ascendant, about the 2 hours in the private study, about being asked to accept 6 reasons being written about him, and not knowing until he was standing in the throne room what it had actually felt like to hear them. Harder than he'd expected, heavier, not in a bad way. In the way things are heavy when they are true, and you had been carrying them at a slight angle for a long time without knowing it. And then someone shows you the right way to hold them, and your arms hurt for a few seconds, and then the weight becomes something you can actually feel clearly for the first time. He did not consider himself particularly worthy of 6 reasons. He thought about this honestly, the way he thought about most things, without flattering himself and without selling himself short. He had done a job. He had done it carefully and completely, and he had not cut corners, and he had not flinched when flinching would have been the natural response. He had kept faith with what he'd been sent to do, even when no one was watching, even when the outcome was unclear, even when the corridor was full of things that wanted to end him. That was not extraordinary. That was what the job was. But then, and this was the thought he kept coming back to, in the dark on the bunk, with the stars moving behind the hull, maybe the Ascendant had been saying something else. Maybe 6 reasons wasn't about what Elias had done. Maybe it was about something simpler and stranger. Maybe it was about the fact that he had done it as himself, without building anything around it, without needing the doing to be witnessed in order to be real. He didn't know. It was possible he was wrong. It was possible the dead king had simply been a leader, who had learned to value the people who did the work instead of the people who talked about doing the work, and had found one of the former and had been relieved and grateful, and had put it on paper. That was probably the simpler answer. But the simpler answer didn't account for the way Arith Voss had said it, the weight in the old commander's voice when he read it. The paper itself, actual paper, which was expensive and rare on any Vreth world, which meant the Ascendant had chosen the medium as well as the message, had said by the choice of material, "This is something I want to last." Elias closed his eyes. He made himself breathe slowly. The body accounting took as long as it took. He thought about going home. What home was specifically. He had a place, a HAB unit on a station in neutral space that he kept for the same reason some people kept a plant, because it required tending and that was good for him. There was a bar nearby that he liked, run by a woman named Priya who had a particular gift for knowing when you wanted to talk and when you wanted to sit in the noise without talking, and who charged fair prices and didn't ask questions. There was a gym. There was a view of the ring, which on good days caught the light in a way that made you think the universe might be making an effort. It was enough. It had always been enough. The missions ended and he went back to it and he replenished, and eventually someone found him or he found them and the next one began. He was aware, somewhere in the accounting, that this one had done something different to him, that the Ascendant study and the paper and the throne room and Saraven's hand against his at the docking bay, that these things had done something to the inside of him that he was going to have to live with and figure out over time. Not a bad thing. Not damage. Something more like a calibration. A small shift in what he understood about what work could mean and who it could mean it to. He fell asleep eventually, and he did not dream of the corridor, which was unusual and which he was grateful for. 3 days into the transit, the ship's communications officer knocked on his bunk compartment and said that there was a closed-channel message waiting for him in the ship's secure relay. Encoded, requiring his biometric clearance. Elias looked at the officer for a moment. The officer, a young Vreth on his first deep space assignment, looked back with the wide optical expression of someone who was not sure whether delivering this message was going to cause him problems. Elias said, "I'll take it in the relay room." The message was from Arith Voss. Text-only secure transmission, no bandwidth for audio. It read, "The new Ascendant has begun her review of the material you provided. She has asked me to relay, through unofficial channels, her personal acknowledgement of the service rendered. She understands your position regarding formal designation. She has chosen to respect it. The asset in supply chain logistics has been identified." behavioral signature method worked exactly as you described. The individual has been taken into custody. Saraven has requested assignment to External Intelligence Liaison. First such request in the division in 11 years. I have approved it. One more thing, which I include because I believe you would want to know it. Before he died, the Ascendant requested that the 6 reasons be read aloud to the full guard, not only to the commanders. I was instructed to do this upon the completion of whatever event triggered the letter's production, that event being, it appears, your presence in the throne room. I read it to the full guard this morning. 312 individuals in formation in the palace courtyard. I do not know what you will make of this. I am not certain I know what to make of it myself, except that when I finished reading, there was a silence of the kind that I have experienced perhaps twice in 40 years of service, and that afterward, when I dismissed them to their posts, every member of the guard touched their thorax plate as they passed me. I thought you should know. Safe transit, Sergeant. A.V. Elias read it twice. He sat with it for a while. Outside the relay room's small porthole, the transit lane was dark and still and full of the specific kind of quiet that deep space offers, the kind that is not empty but dense, full of distance and time and the accumulated weight of everything that has ever crossed it. He thought about 312 beings standing in a courtyard listening to 6 reasons about him. He thought about what that meant and what it did not mean, and which parts of it he was allowed to feel, and which parts he needed to hold lightly, because holding them too hard would change something he didn't want changed. He wrote back. It took him a while to find the right words, and he revised it twice, which was unusual for him. He was better with action than with correspondence, but he found them eventually. He wrote, "Thank you for telling me. Tell the new Ascendant, good luck. I mean it without any conditions on it. Tell Saraven, he's going to be excellent at that job. Make sure he knows that the patience is as important as the observation. The hard part isn't finding what's there. It's waiting long enough to understand it. And tell the guard, all of them, if that's appropriate, that the Ascendant chose well. Not me, them. He saw something in his own guard that he trusted enough to put his faith in a piece of paper after he was gone. He was right. They held. That matters more than anything I did. I'll be in touch if I find something you need to know about the Compact's methodology and other theaters. Quiet, unofficial, same as always. EV." He sent it. He closed the relay terminal. He walked back to his bunk and lay down and stared at the ceiling and let the transit carry him. What the galaxy kept miscalculating about humans, and this was not a new miscalculation, it was very old, and it was unlikely to stop being made, was that they looked, at first and sometimes second and occasionally third glance, like the kind of species that shouldn't matter much. Soft, unarmored, short-lived by galactic standards, without the resonance harmonics of the Vreth or the distributed neural architecture of the Skell or the collective memory of the hive civilizations. Without, most critically, any natural characteristic that read as threatening. They looked like something that had made it to the stars by accident and was getting by on nerve and luck. This was not wrong exactly. Nerve and luck were real things. But the people who stopped at nerve and luck missed the third element, which was harder to name and harder to see until you were standing in a throne room watching it demonstrate itself. Humans had decided, somewhere back in the long slog of their history, that the world and then the station and then the ship and then the galaxy owed them nothing, that the dark did not have to be survivable, that the odds did not have to be good, that the help did not have to arrive, and they had gone in anyway, again and again and again, not because they were certain it would work, because it needed doing and they were there. That decision, made in 10,000 variations by 10,000 individuals across 10,000 situations, had built something, not a weapon exactly, not armor. Something harder to define, a kind of operational faith, not in outcomes but in the act itself. the belief that showing up fully and doing the work was its own sufficient answer to a universe that had not promised to cooperate. Arithvas had seen it in the shipping depot, in a man eating something orange and gelatinous who heard an impossible job description and said okay. Saravan had seen it in a sub-level corridor, in a man who sat cross-legged with his hands in a wall panel, knowing he was about to be caught and doing the work anyway. The Ascendant had seen it in his private study, in a man who said I'm sorry to a dying king, and meant it simply, without agenda, without politics, with nothing behind it except the clean acknowledgement that here is something real and it deserves to be named. 312 members of the Royal Guard had heard about it second-hand, in a courtyard, from a piece of paper, and they had believed it, because Arithvas read it, and Arithvas did not put his weight behind things he had not personally verified, and because some truths are shaped such that even second-hand they arrive with the weight of first-person experience. Elias Vorn was asleep on a supply ship in a transit lane in deep space, dreaming of something ordinary, a meal, a bar, a view of a ring that caught the light, and the Royal Guard of the Vreth Ascendancy went to their posts. They did their work. They held the line. They touched their thorax plates as they passed each other in the corridors of the palace, a small gesture that meant something they didn't have a clean word for, that had become, in the space of one morning in a courtyard, part of the language of the guard. Something that had started with a human in worn boots, who came to do a job and did it and asked for nothing and went home. Something that meant, I see you, you are real. 6 reasons, more than enough. The supply ship docked at Turith Station 11 days later, slightly ahead of schedule, because the navigation AI had found a favorable corridor in the transit lane that its previous routing algorithms would have classified as too marginal to try. A human crew member in the navigation bay had looked at the corridor, done a quick mental calculation, and said that's fine, let's try it, and they had tried it, and it had worked, and 11 hours had been saved, which meant nothing commercially but meant the human got to his bunk 45 minutes earlier that night. These things accumulate. The history of the species, if you looked at it closely enough, was largely a story of trying corridors that should have been too marginal, and then making adjustments when they were, in fact, too marginal, and then trying again. The ratio was not actually that good, but the trying never stopped, and after enough iterations the successes built on each other, and the species had arrived at the stars in a vessel that was an improbable aggregate of all the marginal corridors that had worked. Elias walked off the ship into Turith Station's general concourse with his transit case and his worn boots and his cold thermos, and he stood in the noise and motion of the station for a moment, the layered language of a dozen species, the smell of 3 different catering operations fighting for dominance, the harsh white overheads cutting through the dock haze, and he let himself be back. It always took a minute. The body needed to update. He was standing there doing this when someone sat down on the bench beside him without being invited. He clocked them in his peripheral vision. Human, male, older, a jacket with a civilian cut that didn't quite conceal the posture beneath it. The kind of posture that took decades in a specific profession to build and another decade to learn to hide, and never quite fully hid. Elias said without looking at him, "I'm not debriefing today." The man said, "Nobody's asking you to." "Then why are you sitting on my bench?" "It's a public bench." "It is," Elias agreed. A pause. The concourse moved around them. Somewhere across the hall, a group of Skell children were doing something that generated a harmonics display in colors that human vision could barely track. They chased it around in circles, delighted. The man said, "Word travels." Word always travels. The Vreth Ascendancy's External Intelligence Division just put out a request for joint methodology training with 3 other allied services. That doesn't happen. The Vreth don't share methodology. They invented the phrase operational singularity to describe their doctrine. Sounds like they changed their minds. Something changed their minds. Elias watched the Skell children. He said, "Is this going anywhere useful?" "We have a situation," the man said. "Not Vreth territory. Skell border. The short version is there is a communications problem that has a lot of people pointing things at each other, and nobody on either side wants to be the one who blinks first, because the political cost of blinking is too high." Elias said, "What kind of communications problem?" "The kind where both sides are saying the right words and neither side is being understood. The translators are technically accurate and functionally useless. The Skell read human body language as aggression. Our people read Skell body language as well." "As aggression?" "Yes." Elias finally looked at him. The man was maybe 60, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something honest. He met Elias' gaze without performance. Elias said, "Who else have you got for this?" "You're the first name on the list." "That's not an answer." "Two other names. Both have done border work. Neither has done prolonged embedded operations in alien court environments." A pause. "Neither has the Vreth Ascendancy's External Intelligence Division requesting joint training because of what they personally built." Elias looked at the Skell children. They had stopped chasing the harmonics display and were now sitting in a small cluster, the colors fading, doing something that looked like an argument but probably wasn't. The Skell facial and postural vocabulary for debate was close to the human vocabulary for a serious fight, which was one of the things the man was obliquely describing as a problem. He said, "Skell body language reads as aggression because it is derived from the same base patterns as their hunt coordination signals. It's not hostility. It's the way they pay attention. The intensity comes from the same place as the focus. They don't have a separate register for polite attention, because, in their evolutionary history, the things that required polite attention also required survival-level focus." The man looked at him. He said, "You've studied them." "A bit in transit. I had 11 days. The Skell border situation is probably solvable if someone explains the above to both sides before the next formal session, and then stands in the room and translates posture in real time, not just words, which is harder to do than it sounds, because you have to do it without making either side feel managed, which means you have to do it in a way that looks like it isn't happening." A silence. The man said very carefully, "Are you saying you could do that?" Elias looked at the cold thermos in his hand. He thought about the HAB unit, about Priya and the bar and the view of the ring, about sleep, actual sleep, the kind where you wake up and for a few seconds you don't know where you are because nothing in your body is holding tension and your location sense has taken the night off. He had wanted that. He had been looking forward to it. He said, "How long is the window before the next formal session?" 18 days. "And the transit time to the border?" 6 days each way. He did the math. He said, "That gives me roughly 6 days on station." "It does. I need 4 of them." The man said, "For what?" "Sleep, actual food, a few hours in the gym and one entire afternoon sitting in Priya's bar doing nothing that matters." He looked at the man. "After that, brief me properly. I want the full read on both delegations, their previous sessions, who the decision makers are, and what their internal political pressures look like. I want the Skell behavioral documentation your people have compiled, however bad it is, because it's better than starting from nothing. We can have all of that to you in 48 hours. Give me 72. I want to read it when I'm not running on supply ship recycled air and 11 days of transit food." The man nodded. He stood up. He did not extend his hand. He had the particular awareness of someone who had spent time around people who did not do casual physical contact and had learned to follow the lead. He said, I'll send the preliminary materials to your personal relay. Encrypted standard clearance. Elias said, fine. The man walked away into the concourse. Elias watched him go. Then he watched the Skell children, who had finished their not argument and were now moving in a loose group toward one of the food concessions, the smallest one riding on the back of the largest in a posture that would have read, to the untrained eye, as an extremely aggressive piggyback. It was not aggressive, it was affectionate. He knew the difference now. He stood up. He picked up his transit case. He pointed himself toward the station ring, toward the HAB unit, toward the view of it catching the light. 4 days, he told himself. You have 4 days. He intended to use every hour. What he could not have told you, if you had asked him in those 4 days, was whether he was the kind of person who ended up at the center of impossible situations, because he sought them out or because the situations found him. He had thought about this, on and off, across the years. He did not have a clean answer. What he knew was that when he was in them, in the corridor, in the throne room, in the transit lane between one thing and the next, he was not performing. He was not calculating how it would look. He was not thinking about what it would mean afterward. He was just there, doing the thing that needed doing with whatever he had. That was probably not special. That was probably just what most people were, in the moments that mattered. Most people in the decisive moment did not feel ready. They felt whatever they felt and they did it anyway. He was just someone who had ended up in more decisive moments than average, through a combination of choices and circumstances that he could not have predicted from any single starting point. The job description on his transit manifest said technical consultant. The thing he actually was had no clean word for it in any language he knew. He went home. He slept. He ate actual food. He sat in Priya's bar for 4 hours on the 3rd day and watched the ring catch the light and thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill that had taken years to develop and which he practiced carefully. On the 4th day, the full brief arrived in his relay, and he made coffee, actual hot coffee, from the machine in the HAB unit, the good kind, and he sat down and he read it. The situation was exactly what the man had described, and it was also more complicated than that, the way things always were when you got the full picture instead of the summary. 2 species, a border zone with resource implications, a series of formal sessions that had each made things marginally worse, a translator corps that was technically excellent and situationally blind. Decision-makers on both sides who were under domestic pressure to appear strong, and who had therefore painted themselves into positions they did not actually want to hold but could not exit without political cost. And somewhere in the middle of it, a window, not obvious, not large, the kind of window that only appeared if you knew what to look for and were willing to move through it at the right moment in the right way without making it look like what it was. He read until the coffee was gone. Then he made more coffee. Then he read some more. He annotated as he went, not for anyone else, just for himself, the way he'd always worked, the running commentary that helped him see what was actually there versus what the framing suggested was there. He went to bed at 0100 with the brief annotated and a rough shape in his mind of what he was going to do and why, and he slept without dreaming of corridors, and in the morning he packed his transit case again. Same fatigues, same worn boots. Same thermos cleaned this time. No rank insignia. He had not worn rank insignia in months. He was not sure he was going to start again. He went to the transit bay. He boarded the ship. He drank his coffee. The stars moved around him, and he moved through them. And at the center of whatever came next, he would be exactly what he was, which was not much, to look at, and more than most things could manage when it mattered. That had always been enough. He trusted it would be again.